Hello, I'm Shaun Tan here in my studio in Brunswick in Melbourne, talking to you about the latest project that I've been working on called Rules of Summer. It's a picture book. At the moment it's May in 2013, so I'm not quite finished with it, just applying finishing touches, so a good a time as any to talk about it while it's relatively fresh in my mind. Whenever finishing any creative project, there's two very difficult questions that people always ask me, and in fact would ask any artist or writer, and that is, what is your book about? And secondly, where did the idea come from? As to the first question, it becomes increasingly difficult to answer as you get more and more involved in a project, and the possible meanings of what you're doing start to expand inward and outward. But to give a simple synopsis, it's basically a story of sorts about two young characters, two boys. They might be best friends, they could possibly be brothers. I tend to think of them as brothers, an older one and a younger one, and I'll refer to them in this way, although they're nameless, they don't have any particular identity, they're not from a particular place, and so the reader's very free to interpret it as they will. There's not a linear narrative as such in this book. It's rather a series of images, much like the ones you see around me, and this one in particular, which is an actual painting that will be reproduced in the book. So there are about 25 of these paintings. Together they form almost like a map of a particular kind of childhood experience which centres around the activities of these two boys. It's a relationship that's both very friendly and caring, but also antagonistic, and towards the end of the book begins to disintegrate before finding some kind of redemption and coming together again. In between, we're kind of left with a bit of a puzzle as to what is exactly happening, and this is something that I find especially appealing as a creator, is mysterious imagery, stories where you get a sense of what's going on, but it's not entirely clear, and your imagination is fairly free to construct the details. Towards that end, the book has very little text in it. In fact, you might even see it as a series of paintings where the titles of each painting becomes a text, and they kind of stitch together and they form an impression of an experience, but ultimately it's very open to being read in all sorts of ways, and I hope for both older readers and younger readers to identify with particular scenes, characters, places, situations in their own way. And that's one of the things I've always loved about picture books ever since I started working in this medium about 15 years ago, and that is the ability to just ponder these very open-ended kind of stories that don't have necessarily the kind of structure or dynamic direction that you'll find in novels or films or plays, or those kinds of art forms that have more of a linear or kinetic structure. This is the sort of book that you could open it on any page and spend 5 minutes or an hour pondering the image, close the book, and that would be a sufficient experience. So the second question to answer is, where do the ideas for such a book come from? Again, this is a very difficult question to answer because there's no one single idea. I wish there was, and there was a nice story I could tell, but it really comes about through an accumulation of different bits and pieces over time. I once wrote a story about a ball of poetry that forms by collecting scraps that it finds on the ground over many years, and I feel that my working process is very similar to that. To go back to origins, it usually begins with fairly random kind of sketches in sketchbooks. This is an example of one sketchbook, and here I'm already starting to think about a particular theme. But the images don't necessarily have much in common, and the act of drawing and doodling is very much a very free, liberating process of wandering around with a pencil in my hand, not worrying about meaning or content or continuity of any of those problems that usually come later when developing a project, but just spooling out random ideas, almost like free association or daydreaming. And now occasionally some of those ideas start to have things in common, and I noticed in a lot of my sketches I would have two characters. Sometimes they'd be adults and sometimes they'd be children, but they'd always be close to each other and interacting with some quite peculiar situation. And often they would be quite small in the landscape, as if the situation could possibly be overwhelming. And this is something that's maybe to do with personal experience. It might be to do with memories, or just a stylistic thing. I'm just attracted to this sort of imagery for reasons that I can't explain.